And so he expected his students to remember this, because his students were going to have to carry this on, right? And so, so Jesus he must have tested their knowledge. He challenged their memories. He would have rehearsed their memories in his preaching and his teaching. So that's the first stage of the development of what these writers of the Gospels would have been carrying on. Stage 2 is the preaching of Jesus' students. So now his students start to preach, right? Jesus sent them out multiple times, right, to go out and preach the gospel. And so, so the preaching of Jesus' students, they remember, they taught what he said and what he did. And so their preaching was based on this skilled memory and repetition, but it's also, getting better as they teach. Stage 3 is the actual writing of the Gospels. Eventually, these stories are written down by the eyewitnesses, or handed on to them by eyewitnesses who were present with Jesus from the very Okay, so I'm going to end with this today. So what's the reason for the dating of the Gospels as we think about them? The one main event that the Gospels are dated around, anybody remember? What's the one event that's really important that we can tell by the writings that this one event happened, and not Jesus' death? But how do we know when there's kind of a stop point of when the Gospels couldn't have been? So Brant Petrie actually focuses on this, and that is the destruction of the temple. The destruction of the temple was a huge event. It's something Jesus prophesied, right? And that happened in 70 AD. So in 70 AD is when the destruction of the temple happened. In each of the 4 Gospels, there's a prophecy that the temple's going to be destroyed. And so if this had already happened, which it did in 70 AD, then they surely would have spoken of it, right? And not just given a prophecy. And so although modern scholarship thinks that the Gospels were written much later, if you look at it realistically, why wouldn't they have talked about it? It would have been a proof of the prophecy of Christ that it actually came true. And yet none of them did. And so this is why we believe that the Gospels are actually written prior to 70 AD. And so, so that's kind of a date that we're going to kind of situate as central to the dating of the Gospels as we move forward. Any questions or comments about any of that before I put the video on? That hopefully will reaffirm everything that we've talked about. And we're going to look at Brant Petrie, who's actually the author of the book that you're all reading. So if you don't have the book, The Case for Jesus, you need to get it. You need to read, and I'm going to question you about it every time. So please have something to say about it. Okay. And I'll turn that on. No questions, no comments, no concerns. And then once this is over, I'll be up at the back with exams, and I'll call your name, so I'll have your exam by the time you get up there, so you can grab it. And then if you have questions, feel free to email me, or if you need to stay afterwards to talk, happy to do that. Oh, I stole somebody's pen too. Whose pen did I steal? So I'll give it to you when you come up.
Welcome everyone to our Lexio Bible study on Jesus. We will be looking at biblical and historical evidence for Christ. My name is Dr. Brant Petrie. I am the research professor of sacred scripture here at the Augusta Institute in Denver. And I'm very, very excited to be with you again in this Bible study, looking at the biblical evidence for our Lord. biblical evidence for Christ. One reason I'm excited about this is because what we'll be doing is kind of walking through some of the material in a book that I recently published called The Case for Jesus, Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ. And this Lexio Bible study is going to kind of summarize the main themes in that book. So if you want to dive in a little deeper, I encourage you to go and get the book and read it. We're going to be looking at a topic that, at least for me, as a creative Catholic, I'm a born pagan and then baptized Catholic shortly thereafter. But being Catholic my whole life, I grew up learning about the catechism, I grew up learning about the church and the history of the church and different doctrines. But this study of Jesus is going to be a little bit different because we're going to be looking at him through the lens of history and asking ourselves the question, not just, do you believe in Jesus? I think most Catholics, you'd ask them, Christians, do you believe in Jesus? Their answer is, well, yes, of course I believe in Jesus. But we want to take the next step and ask this question. Why do you believe in Jesus? Has anyone ever asked you that? Have you ever pondered that? If someone came up to you and said, well, why do you believe in Jesus? What would you say? How would you answer? Right? If someone said, well, why do you believe in Jesus and not in Muhammad or Buddha, right? Or some other religious leader, what would you say? What are the reasons for your faith? And again, for many of us, like myself, I received the faith as a gift from my parents and my grandparents. And that's a gift which I can never repay. But at the same time, as we grow into adulthood, we also want to ask ourselves, well, what are the reasons for continuing to believe, to hold the faith? And I think in our day and time, too, especially in an increasingly secular world, you can no longer assume that, well, everyone believes in Jesus. So I don't have to explain, I don't have to give the reasons for my faith, right? Especially if you're engaged in the new evangelization, sharing the gospel, either with people who haven't heard it, or with people who've fallen away from the Christian faith and from the Catholic Church. So this study of Jesus and of the evidence for Christ is, I think, very, very timely, very crucial for what we're doing right now in the church with the new evangelization in this new millennium. So we're going to be looking at a number of questions over the course of this Lexio Bible study. We're going to be taking up issues such as, who wrote the Gospels? What about the lost Gospels that you hear about on the Discovery Channel, the History Channel? Why do we as Christians believe in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not these other Gospels? What kind of books are the Gospels? Are they fact? Or are they hopeful? Fact or fiction? When were they written? Are they early enough to be reliable accounts of Jesus? Or are they too late to really tell us the truth about what Jesus did, what Jesus did say? We'll also be looking at questions such as, was Jesus in fact the Messiah? Most Catholics again say, well, of course he was the Messiah. But then if you ask, well, how do you know he was the Messiah? I'll never forget one time I was teaching a seminary course. I said, how many of you believe that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies of the Messiah in the Old Testament? And every hand went up. And I said, good. Now, which prophecies did he fulfill? Silence. You hear the grass cutting outside the building. Oh, I don't know. Well, how do you answer that question? So, was he the Messiah? Did he claim to be God?
There's been this trend lately where so-called health experts claim collagen make you feel like you're aging backwards. Take this collagen supplement, they say, your skin will look smoother, your joints will feel better, you'll feel stronger and younger, your digestion will be better. Here's the problem. Part of what they're saying is true, and part of it is a lie. The truth.
Or was he just a great moral teacher? Right? And if he did claim to be God, why was he crucified? Why did he cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then last, certainly not least, what about the resurrection? Why do Christians believe in the resurrection? What's the evidence for Jesus being raised from the dead? So these are the kind of things we're going to be looking at, and as you'll see, step by step, I want to lay out the case for Jesus. The reasons for believing that Jesus is in fact who we as Christians claim him to be, confess him to be. Not just the Messiah, the long-awaited King of Israel, but God incarnate. So that's my goal for our session. I hope you're as excited as I am about diving in. So in order to do this, though, we're going to need to begin first with the Gospels themselves. We're going to need to take a couple of sessions to really back up and look at what kind of books the Gospels are, who wrote them, and how reliable they are, before we can get into the issue of what they actually say about Jesus, what they claim about Jesus. So in this first session, I'm going to start in a place that might seem a little surprising, but it's very important, and it's with this issue, namely the anonymity of the Gospels. Or you could ask it this way: who wrote the four Gospels? Because if you know anything about the New Testament, you'll know that the bulk of our information about Jesus really doesn't come from the letters of Paul or Peter or James and Jude. It comes from the four Gospels traditionally ascribed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the primary, they are the primary sources, the foundational sources for the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus. And if, again, you're like me, you grew up Christian, you grew up Catholic, most of your life you probably just believe, well, I open my Bible, I look in there, and it says the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, and Gospel of John, and so that must be who wrote the Gospels. And for about 19 centuries, that's what everyone believed. Well, almost everyone, you'll see, about the Gospels. But in the last 100 years or so, there are two, well, one of them is really a theory, but one of them is more of an opinion or an analogy, but there are two theories about the Gospel origins that have arisen that have really fundamentally changed the way people are looking at the Gospels today, and especially what people are hearing about the Gospels in the context of university settings and classroom settings. And those two theories are, number one, the theory of the anonymous Gospels, and then number two, the so-called analogy of the telephone game, right? So the anonymous gospel theory and the telephone game. Let me just kind of lay these out for you for just a minute. In the last 100 years, this theory of the Gospels originally being anonymous has arisen. And according to this theory, there are basically four main points to it. Number one, according to this theory, although your Bible has titles on each of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, originally they were not published with any names attached to them. Originally they were anonymous. There was no Gospel according to Mark or according to John. There was just the text of the Gospels. And these Gospels, according to this theory, number two, circulated throughout the ancient Roman Empire. They were copied down by scribes and recopied and distributed without any titles for about a century, before the titles were later added to them in the late 2nd century in order to give them authority, right? In other words, according to this theory, the title Matthew was added sometime in the 2nd century to make people think that Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, wrote it. And the title John was added to make people believe that the Apostle John had actually written it, in order to give these works authority. It was what scholars refer to as a false attribution, right? Or pseudepigraphy, false writing. Now, according to this theory, then, the upshot of it really is that none of the four Gospels that we have in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, was written actually by an eyewitness to Jesus. We don't know who wrote them. They were obviously written by believing Christians who may or may not have had access to true or untrue traditions about Jesus of Nazareth, but we don't actually know who wrote them because they were originally anonymous. Now, just to put this in an autobiographical context, this was the theory I learned when I was a young undergraduate student, taking my first classes in religious studies. I still remember when my professor came into the room and told us, I want you to forget everything you think you knew about who wrote the Gospels. I know you probably grew up thinking that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the apostles and their companions wrote them, but scholars today know that originally they were anonymous and that they weren't written by eyewitnesses to Jesus. So of course, I'm a good student, A student, of course, right? Writing down, oh, I didn't know that. No one said anything about this in catechism class, and we just, took it down and I took it in and I believed it. And then a second thing that I was taught kind of flowed out of it. Because the obvious question that comes from that is, well, wait, if they weren't written by eyewitnesses to Jesus, then how reliable are the stories about Jesus in the Gospels? I mean, if we don't know who wrote them, then can we verify them or not? And so my teacher, and one of the textbooks I used, gave an analogy for helping the students understand what kind of stories were in the Gospels. And the analogy, very sophisticated analogy, was of the telephone game. Has anybody ever heard of the telephone game? Okay, has anyone ever heard of the telephone game analogy? All right? Well, this was the analogy. I remember it being used in my classroom. I'm going to give you a quote here from the most widely used New Testament introduction in universities in the United States today. It's by a scholar named Bart Ehrman. He's not a Catholic. In fact, he's not a Christian anymore. He used to be Christian, but he's now an atheist. And his introduction to the New Testament, which I myself used as a student, gives an analogy from the children's telephone game in order to help students understand the kind of stories about Jesus in the Gospels. And I'm going to quote Ehrman's words verbatim here. This is what he says. Listen to this. Nearly all of the storytellers, meaning people telling stories about Jesus, had no independent knowledge of what really happened to Jesus. Now, it takes little imagination to realize what happens to the stories. You're probably familiar with the old birthday party game, telephone. A group of kids sits in a circle. The first tells a brief story to the one sitting next to her, who tells it to the next, and to the next, and so on, until it comes back full circle to the one who started. Invariably, the story has changed so much in the process of retelling that everyone gets a good laugh. Now, imagine the same activity taking place not in a solitary living room with 10 kids on one afternoon, but over the expanse of the Roman Empire, some 2,500 miles across, with thousands. Now, if Aaron's right, and this is an appropriate analogy for the stories about Jesus in the Gospels, then what does that do to the credibility of the Gospel? What does the telephone game analogy do to the students who take that in and think, oh, well, this is what the story about Jesus in the Gospels are like? Well, completely destroys their credibility, no? Because the whole point of the telephone game is that the story changes. And doesn't just change in minor ways, but changes dramatically, right? So you'll frequently find in the 20th century, and this is a new idea, these two approaches to the Gospels, that we don't know who wrote them, and that they weren't written by eyewitnesses, and that the stories in the Gospels are like this game of telephone. Those two approaches to the text lay the foundation for a very deep skepticism toward what the Gospels say about Jesus. So that in our day and time, and I have lots of friends who teach in Catholic high schools, it has now trickled down from the ivory tower of the academy into popular imaginations that the Gospels themselves aren't reliable testimony to Jesus. So you might say, well, this Gospel says that, and someone will say, well, yeah, but how do I know that that actually happened? What if the Gospels are anonymous? How do I know? All right, so how do we respond to that? What is the case with regard to the anonymity and authorship of the Gospel? Well, again, just to speak autobiographically, for much of my education, from my undergraduate through my master's degree, this was the approach that I took, because it was the majority opinion. Let me be clear here. Bart Ehrman is not alone in holding this view of the Gospels not being written by eyewitnesses and them being analogous to a telephone game. This is a widely held view among scholars in universities. This is the majority opinion that the Gospels were originally anonymous. And I myself accepted it before I went to begin my doctoral studies at the University of Notre Dame. But when I was there, one of the things you have to do to get a PhD in New Testament is you have to learn a number of languages. You have to learn Hebrew, you have to learn Greek. And you also start to begin studying not just what a textbook says, but you start to read more scholar. You study the text in their original languages. And you start to go back and look at what ancient authors themselves have to say about it. And one of the things that was fascinating for me as a doctoral student was this whole question of the anonymity of the Gospel. Because we began to do, as students, what was known as textual criticism, which is where you don't just study various books about the New Testament, but you actually go back to the manuscripts themselves and you look at the text of the New Testament. And I'll never forget asking one of my professors about this. When it came to the anonymous Gospels, I wanted to know, well, where are the anonymous copies?
What?
Because I wanted to see, surely if the text were originally anonymous, then there would be the oldest manuscripts wouldn't have titles. And he said, that's a good question. Why don't you go and research it? I did. I started to look into it like that. And one of the first, cracks in this foundation that had been laid for me in having a kind of skeptical attitude toward the Gospels was the fact that I discovered that there are no anonymous copies.
Need inspiration? Shop Cooper for thousands of advertising
supposed to work with evidence, right? That's a very important principle of textual criticism. And one of the things I do in my book is I just take you through a little going through all the earliest manuscripts for each one of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Looking at both ancient Greek papyri, fragments of the Gospels, as well as ancient Greek codexes, codices, which are longer copies of the Gospel. And what I found is all of the earliest copies, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, every single one of them has a title. There are precisely 0 anonymous copies of the Gospel. Now, that's a real problem with the theory, because the theory is supposed to be a historical theory. The historical theory is supposed to work with evidence. So, for example, by analogy, imagine if I told you that originally the Gospel of Matthew was published without the Sermon on the Mount. It wasn't there. Your very first question should be, oh, really? What copies of the Gospel of Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount missing from? Not to say, well, none of them. But trust me, originally, it wasn't there, right? You would have good grounds for being what? Skeptical about my theory that the sermon wasn't originally part of the Gospel. Well, the same thing's true about the anonymity of the Gospels. If they were originally anonymous, then why don't any copy, not one? And we have not just hundreds of ancient Greek copies of the Gospels. We actually have thousands of ancient manuscripts of the Gospels and other New Testament writings. There are more manuscripts of the New Testament than any other ancient document. Okay? So, first problem, Greek manuscript evidence, no anonymous copies. And then as I began to read more other scholars, like Richard Baldwin, a British scholar, and others, and Mark Hengel, a German scholar, I began to discover that there are other problems with the idea that the Gospels were anonymous. Namely, that the anonymous scenario, the theory itself, is kind of unbelievable. It's kind of incredible if you step back for just a moment and think about it. Ponder this. If the Gospels had, in fact, been originally published with no titles, and they circulated for 100 years throughout the Roman Empire, then how did the scribes at the end of the 2nd century, writing in Egypt, and Gaul, and Italy, and Asia Minor, how did they all memorize the exact same titles to the same books? Why don't we have discrepancies? In other words, the same book